The lantern flame danced shadows across the barn walls, and Joseph Garrett's hands moved with the kind of certainty that comes from 12 years of losing. 20 below zero outside. The wind howled like something alive and hungry, rattling the barn boards, searching for gaps. Inside, a cow lay on her side in the straw, eyes rolling white with pain, and Dan knew what was coming before he saw it. Breech birth, the calf was coming wrong. Hind legs first instead of front, which meant the mother would die trying to push it out, and the calf would die stuck halfway between one world and the next. Dan had seen it happen before. Too many times, but not tonight. He stripped off his coat, despite the cold, rolled up his sleeves, and knelt in the straw beside the struggling animal. His breath came out in white clouds. The cow's breathing came in terrible, labored gasps. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered the math he already knew. 50 head of cattle left on his ranch. Lose this cow and her calf, and he'd be down to 48. Lose enough, and Harrison Thorne would finally get what he wanted. Dan's hands found the calf's rear hooves inside the mother, slick and warm. He closed his eyes, feeling for the position, building a map in his mind of what couldn't be seen. The front legs were folded back against the calf's chest. The head was turned wrong. Everything that could go wrong had gone wrong, and if he forced it now, if he pulled too hard or too fast, he'd kill them both. So he didn't force it. Instead, his hands worked slowly, methodically, with the kind of patience that looks like nothing is happening at all. He found the calf's shoulder, pushed it back deeper into the mother, even though every instinct screamed to pull. The cow bellowed, but Dan kept pushing, kept working, kept breathing. His fingers found the front leg, drew it forward, found the other, drew that forward too, shifted the head. The calf's nose appeared, then the whole head, then the shoulders. And then with one final push from the mother, the entire calf slid out into Dan's waiting hands, covered in fluid and membrane, not breathing. Dan moved fast now, cleared the mouth and nostrils with his fingers, rubbed the small body vigorously with straw, stimulating the lungs, forcing air to move. Come on, he thought. Come on, you stubborn little thing. Come on. The calf gasped, coughed, gasped again, and then it was breathing, chest rising and falling, legs beginning to twitch with the urge to stand. Dan sat back in the straw, exhausted, watching the mother nose her baby with the kind of gentle insistence that knows how to make life keep living. His hands were shaking. From cold or from the near loss, he couldn't say. Probably both. He looked at the barn door where a piece of paper was nailed to the wood. White against brown. He didn't need to read it. He'd memorized every word 3 days ago when the bank messenger had ridden out through the snow to deliver it. Final notice, 800 due by March 31st, 1885. Failure to pay will result in foreclosure. 3 months. That's all the time Joseph Garrett had left before losing everything his hands had built. The land his brothers had said was worthless. The ranch he'd carved from rock and disappointment. The cattle he'd kept alive through drought and disease and every other thing the Wyoming Territory could throw at a man too stubborn to quit. But stubbornness didn't pay bank loans. And the calf he'd just saved, miraculous as it was, wouldn't be worth selling for 8 months. By then it would all belong to Harrison Thorne. Dan pulled his coat back on and walked out into the blizzard, leaving the barn door cracked so the new mother and her calf would have shelter but not be trapped if something went wrong. The cold hit him like a fist. Snow came at him sideways, stinging his face, finding every gap in his clothing. He couldn't see the cabin from here. Couldn't see anything but white and more white. But 15 miles away in a saloon in Bitter Creek that smelled like tobacco and whiskey, in desperation, a woman was standing on a wooden platform with 5 children clinging to her threadbare skirt, and in less than an hour, she would change his life for $3 silver. Margaret Brennan sat in the corner of the saloon with her children pressed against her and did math in her head because it was the only thing that kept the fear at bay. She'd sold her wedding ring for $5, her mother's Bible for $3, their winter coats for $8, the last piece of jewelry she owned for $12, $28 total. Train tickets west from Philadelphia had cost $25. That left $3 for 6 people for 6 days. 3 divided by 6 equals 50 cents per person. 50 cents times 6 days equals 8 cents per person per day. A loaf of bread costs 15 cents. A person could not survive on 8 cents per day. Therefore, the mail-order bride program was not a choice. It was the only equation that balanced. Margaret looked down at the paper in her hands, a list written in her careful script. Every item she'd owned, every price she'd gotten, every calculation that had led to this moment. Her daughter Catherine, age 14, leaned against her shoulder and whispered, "Mama, I can work. I can go to the factories and make money, and you won't have to do this." "You're 14, Margaret said quietly. "No one hires 14-year-olds for wages that matter." Benjamin, 9 years old, pulled away from the group and said with the kind of anger that comes from grief not yet finished, "This is Papa's fault. If he hadn't been so weak, if he hadn't walked into that blizzard and left us with nothing, we wouldn't be here." Margaret's voice went sharp. "Your papa's dead, Ben. Blaming him won't feed you." James, the 6-year-old, coughed, that terrible rattling cough that had been getting worse for weeks. "Mama," he said, voice small and hoarse, "I'm cold." "I know, baby," Margaret said, and her heart broke a little more because she couldn't make him warm. Not with 8 cents per person per day. Not with everything they'd owned, sold to strangers who'd paid half what it was worth because they knew desperation when they saw it. 3-year-old Rose pressed her face into Margaret's neck and whimpered. The auctioneer, a round man named Silas Whitmore, called from across the saloon, "Mrs. Brennan, you're up next." Margaret stood. She'd altered her black morning dress 3 times to hide how much weight she'd lost. She'd turned it inside out so the faded side looked almost new. She'd let down the hem to hide her worn shoes. She knew how to make nothing look like something, how to appear more valuable than the sum of her parts, because her father had taught her about presentation before he'd taught her about numbers. But as she climbed the wooden steps to the platform with her 5 children following like ducklings, she knew presentation could only do so much when you were a 32-year-old widow with no money, no prospects, and 5 mouths to feed. Silas cleared his throat and addressed the crowd of men in the saloon. "Gentlemen, Mrs. Brennan here. Widow from Philadelphia. Educated woman. Can read, write, do figures. She's got experience running a household and running it into the ground from the looks of her," someone shouted. Laughter rippled through the room like a wave. Margaret felt her face burn, but she kept her chin up. She'd promised herself that much. Whatever happened today, her children would not see her break. "She's got 5 young'uns," another voice called out. "Who's gonna feed all them mouths I can barely feed myself? Ain't no charity here, Silas. We came for wives, not whole orphanages." More laughter, louder this time. Ruth, 11 years old, tugged at Margaret's hand. "Mama, why are they being so mean?" "Hush now," Margaret murmured. "Stand tall, baby. Brennan, stand tall." But standing tall took everything she had. 2 years of standing tall. 2 years since Patrick had walked into a Pennsylvania blizzard and never come back. 2 years of watching her children grow thinner, watching their clothes fall apart, watching hope drain from their eyes like water from a cracked cup. The mail-order bride program had been her last option. She'd spent her final coins on train tickets west, believing that someone somewhere would want her. That belief now seemed foolish beyond measure. Margaret counted the men in the room while Silas tried to generate interest. 23 total. 7 had already walked out when they'd seen her and her children. 12 were watching with contempt. 4 with pity. 0 with anything resembling interest. The math was simple and cruel. "Let's start the bidding at $50, Silas said, his enthusiasm fading with each word. "That's more than fair for a woman of Mrs. Brennan's education and—" Silence. "All right, $40. Surely someone—" Nothing. 25. A man near the front stood up and pushed his way toward the door. "Ain't no point in staying for this. There's other women waiting. Good women. Women without baggage." Margaret flinched as though she'd been struck. Baggage. Her children were baggage now. These 5 beautiful, frightened, hungry souls who'd done nothing wrong except be born to a mother who couldn't protect them from the world's cruelty. Benjamin stepped forward, his small fists clenched tight. "My mama ain't baggage. She's the best mama in the whole world, and you're all just—" Margaret caught his shoulder. "Enough, Ben." "But Mama, they can't—" "I said enough." The boy's eyes filled with tears, but he stepped back. His jaw was tight with fury and helplessness, and Margaret saw in his face the same impotent rage she felt burning in her own chest. But rage wouldn't buy bread. Rage wouldn't keep them alive. $10, Silas tried, mopping his forehead with a stained handkerchief. "Come now, gentlemen. Mrs. Brennan is healthy, capable, hardworking." She's skin and bones, Silas. Look at her. It was true. Margaret had given her portions to her children for months. The dress hung on her frame like a sack on a scarecrow. $5 then. Anyone? The silence stretched on, broken only by James's soft coughing and the wind howling against the windows. Outside, snow was piling up. Inside, Margaret's last hope was dying by degrees. She looked at James's feverish face, at Rose's frightened eyes, at Catherine trying so hard to be brave, at Ruth watching everything with the kind of awareness that children shouldn't have to possess, at Benjamin shaking with the need to fight a battle he was too young to win. If no one bid on her today, they would be turned out into that snow. The program had rules. Unclaimed women were sent back east. But Margaret had no money for tickets. She had $3 and the clothes on their backs and absolutely nothing else. "Mama," James whispered, pressing against her leg, "are we going to die?" Margaret's heart cracked just a little bit more. She knelt down and looked into her son's fever-bright eyes and said with all the certainty she could muster, "No, baby, we are not going to die. Brennans don't die, we survive." But even as she said it, she wondered if it was a lie. The door at the back of the saloon opened. Cold air rushed in, carrying snowflakes that melted the moment they touched the warmth inside. Every head turned to see who had entered. He was tall. That was Margaret's first impression. Tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that had seen better days but was well-maintained nonetheless. His boots were caked with mud and snow. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face. When he closed the door behind him and stepped inside, he moved with the careful economy of a man who had learned not to waste energy. "Well, well," Silas said, brightening. "Mr. Garrett didn't expect to see you here today." The man didn't respond immediately. He was scanning the room, taking in the crowd, the platform of the remaining women waiting along the wall. Then his gaze found Margaret. She felt it like a physical touch. Those eyes, gray-blue like winter sky, traveled over her face, her thin frame, her children clustered around her like frightened chicks. The assessment lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then he looked away, and Margaret felt strangely bereft, as if something important had just been offered and then withdrawn. "What's the situation here, Silas?" The man's voice was quiet, but it carried through the saloon without effort. "Ah!" Silas's enthusiasm dimmed. "This is Mrs. Brennan, widow from Philadelphia. 5 children. We've been having some difficulty finding her a match." "I can see that." Someone in the crowd snickered. "She's all yours if you want her, Garrett. Ain't nobody else gonna bid on that mess." The stranger turned slowly to look at the man who had spoken. Just looked at him. Didn't say a word. The man's smile faded. He suddenly found his drink very intriguing. "Resting immediately." The stranger turned back to the platform. To Margaret. "Ma'am," he said. Margaret nodded stiffly. "Sir, these your children?" "They are. All 5 of them. Every single one." He studied her for a long moment. Not the way the other men had looked at her, cataloging problems and expenses. This man looked at her like he was trying to see something underneath the surface. "What happened to your husband?" he asked. "He died," Margaret said flatly, 2 years ago. "How?" Margaret hesitated. She told this story so many times it had become just words, empty of the pain that used to live in them. "He walked into a blizzard. They found his body 3 days later." The stranger's expression didn't change. "On purpose?" The question hit like a slap. No one ever asked that. No one ever acknowledged the possibility that Patrick hadn't gotten lost, that he'd made a choice. "I don't know," Margaret said quietly. It was the truth. After 2 years, it was still the truth. "Does it matter?" "Might." The stranger looked at her children one by one. Catherine trying to look brave. Ruth curious despite her fear. Benjamin still angry. James coughing into his sleeve. Rose's face buried in Margaret's neck. "Your boy there," the man said. "He's sick." "Just a cough." "Sounds like more than a cough." Margaret's arms tightened around Rose. "He needs warmth and good food and rest. Things I can't give him right now." "Can't or won't," her temper flared. "Can't, sir. If I could, don't you think I would? Do you think I enjoy watching my children suffer? Do you think I wanted to end up here being passed over like spoiled meat while men mock my family?" The room had gone silent. The stranger's lips twitched, almost a smile. "You got fire, ma'am. That's good." "Fire doesn't feed children, Mr. Garrett." No, he agreed, but it keeps them alive long enough to find food. He turned to Silas. What's the current bid? Silas blinked. Well, there isn't one, strictly speaking. Then I'll start one. The stranger reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He opened it and looked inside, and for just a moment, his jaw tightened in a way that was almost imperceptible. But Margaret saw it. She'd learned to read the smallest signs of financial distress. $3, the stranger said. Someone burst out laughing. $3? Hell, Garrett, that's less than the cost of a lame mule. It's all I got. The laughter died as men exchanged uncomfortable glances. $3. The amount was so small as to be insulting, except that everyone in the saloon could see it wasn't an insult. It was the literal truth. $3, the stranger repeated, looking at Silas, for the woman and her children, all of them. Mr. Garrett, Silas leaned forward, lowering his voice. Perhaps you should reconsider. 5 children is considerable. Did I stutter? No, sir. Then write up the papers. Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. $3. Her value had been assessed at $3. Less than a horse, less than a good pair of boots. But it was $3 more than anyone else had offered. She looked at the stranger, this man who was willing to spend what appeared to be his last money on a woman and 5 children he didn't know. And she said, wait. The stranger looked at her. I want to know why, Margaret said. Ma'am, why would you do this? You don't know me. You don't know my children. $3 might be nothing to these men, but I can see it's not nothing to you. She gestured at his worn coat, his patched boots. So why? The room held its breath. The stranger was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret had the sense that he was choosing his words carefully, weighing each one before speaking. When I came in here, he said finally, I saw a room full of men who couldn't see past their own convenience. I saw a woman standing alone, holding her ground, refusing to break even when everyone wanted her to. He paused. I know what that feels like. Margaret stared at him, something shifting in her chest. You asked why, the stranger continued. Here's your answer. I got a ranch 15 miles outside town. It's failing. I got debts I can't pay, and a winter coming that might kill what's left of my cattle. I got nothing to offer you but hard work and cold nights and probably a lot of disappointment. Then why? Margaret asked again. Because you're still standing, he said simply, after everything. Losing your husband, raising 5 kids alone, ending up in the godforsaken saloon with men treating you like garbage. You're still standing. That means something to me. He reached into the pouch and pulled out 3 silver dollars. They clinked against each other in his palm, each sound distinct and final. This is everything I have, ma'am. Everything. I'm offering it to you because I reckon we might be able to help each other. Not because you're desperate. Hell, we're both desperate. But because desperate people sometimes see things clearly that comfortable people miss. Margaret's throat was tight. Her eyes were burning. In all her life, no one had ever valued her desperation as anything other than a weakness to exploit. And if I say no, she asked, then I'll walk out that door and you'll never see me again. I won't force you into anything, Mrs. Brennan. I ain't that kind of man. Mama, Catherine's voice was barely a whisper. Mama, James needs a doctor. Margaret looked at her son. James's face was flushed with fever, his breath rattling in his chest. He needed warmth medicine food. She looked at her daughters, Catherine trying so hard to be strong, Ruth still believing things could get better. Rose too young to understand anything except that Mama was scared. She looked at Benjamin, her boy, who was so angry at a world that had stolen his father and was threatening to steal everything else. Then she looked at the stranger, a man with gray eyes and 3 silver dollars and nothing to offer but honesty. What's your ranch like? She asked. Small log cabin, 2 rooms, barn standing but needs work. Got about 50 head of cattle. Is it warm? Got a fireplace. Burns hot when there's wood enough. Is there food? Not much. Enough to get through a few weeks if we're careful. Books. The stranger blinked, clearly surprised. Ma'am, I asked if you have books. My children need to learn. I won't let them grow up ignorant no matter what else happens. For the first time, something like respect flickered in the stranger's eyes. Got a Bible, nothing else. Then we'll start with that. Margaret took a deep breath. She looked at her children, at their thin faces, their hopeful eyes, that terrible, precious trust that somehow, some way, she would make things right. Then she looked at the stranger and said, "All right, yes." The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water. The stranger nodded once. He walked forward and placed the $3 silver on Silas's table. The coins rang against the wood, a small sound, but it echoed through the room like a bell. "Get the papers," he said to Silas, "and someone find me a blanket for that boy." Nobody moved. The stranger turned and looked at the crowd, just looked. His hand didn't move toward his gun, but suddenly everyone was very aware that he was wearing one. "I said," he repeated quietly, "someone find me a blanket." A man near the back scrambled to comply. The stranger climbed onto the platform. Up close, Margaret could see the lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his dark hair, the calluses on his hands. A man who had worked hard for everything he had and probably lost most of it anyway. "Your boy," he said quietly, crouching down to James's level. "What's his name?" "James. We call him Jamie." "Jamie." The stranger's voice was gentle now, so different from the hard tone he'd used with the crowd. "Son, can you hear me?" Jamie nodded weakly. "I'm going to pick you up now, all right? Wrap you in a blanket and carry you out to my wagon. It'll be cold outside, but we'll get you warm soon." "You trust me?" Jamie looked at Margaret. "It's all right, baby," she wanted to say. "You can trust him." But the words stuck in her throat because how could she promise that? She didn't know this man, didn't know if his promises meant anything. But Jamie looked back at the stranger and said in his small, hoarse voice, "You gonna take care of my mama?" "That's the plan." "Promise?" The stranger was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I promise I'll try." That's the honest answer. "I can't promise everything will be easy, but I can promise I'll try harder than I've tried at anything in my life." Jamie considered this with the gravity only a sick child could muster. Then he held out his arms. The stranger lifted him carefully, cradling the boy against his chest. Someone thrust a blanket at him, and he wrapped Jamie up tight, making sure the small face was protected from the wind they'd face outside. "Mrs. Brennan," the stranger said, looking at Margaret, "can your other children walk to the wagon?" "We can walk," Catherine said firmly. "We've walked farther than 15 miles before." "Not in snow like this, you haven't." "We can do it," Ruth piped up. "We're Brennans. Brennans can do anything." Something almost soft crossed the stranger's face. "That's so. Mama says so." "Well then," he looked at Margaret, "sounds like your mama's a smart woman." "She's the smartest person in the whole world," Rose announced from Margaret's arms. "She knows everything." "Everything?" A hint of amusement touched the stranger's voice. "Everything. Everything. Then I reckon I made a good investment." Silas was waving them over to sign papers. Margaret walked to the table and picked up the pen with steady hands. She signed her name in neat, careful script. Margaret Rose Brennan. Then she watched the stranger add his own signature. Rougher but legible. Joseph Samuel Garrett. "This is highly unusual," Silas muttered as he stamped the documents. "Most irregular. 5 children, $3. I've never seen the like." "Write it down in your records," Joseph Garrett said. "Might make for an interesting story someday." He handed the papers to Margaret. She folded them carefully and tucked them into her dress next to her heart. "Mrs. Garrett," Joseph said. Margaret startled. She'd forgotten. She had a new name now. "That's me," she said. "I suppose it is." "Ready to go home." Home. Such a simple word. Such an enormous promise. Margaret looked around the saloon one last time. At the men who hadn't wanted her. At the women still waiting along the wall, some watching with envy, others with pity. At Silas already moving on to the next auction. Then she looked at her children. At Benjamin, still wary but curious now. At Catherine, shouldering the family's one carpet bag. At Ruth, bouncing on her toes with anxious energy. At Rose, thumb in mouth, watching everything with wide eyes. At Jamie, wrapped in a stranger's arms, already half asleep against Joseph Garrett's shoulder. "Yes," Margaret said, "we're ready." The cold hit them the moment they stepped outside. Margaret gasped, the air so frigid it burned her lungs. She'd forgotten how brutal Wyoming winters could be. "Here," Joseph was shrugging off his coat, one-handed still holding Jamie. "Put this on." "Mr. Garrett, I couldn't." You can and you will. I'm used to cold. You ain't. Put it on. Margaret hesitated, then took the coat. It was still warm from his body, heavy with the smell of horses and wood smoke. She wrapped it around herself and immediately felt better. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. The wagon ain't much warmer. The wagon was in fact barely warmer than standing in the open air, but Joseph had laid down hay in the bed and covered it with another blanket he produced from somewhere. Catherine, he said to Margaret's oldest, your job is to keep your brothers and sisters warm. Don't let that blanket slip, understood? Yes, sir, Catherine said. Don't have to call me, sir. Just Garrett's fine. Or Dan. That's what folks called me growing up. Catherine considered this. Mr. Dan? Close enough, he turned to Margaret. Ma'am, you can ride up front with me or in the back with your children. Your choice. Margaret looked at the front seat. Exposed cold nothing between her and the wind but the borrowed coat. Then she looked at her children huddled together under the blanket. Up front, she said. I want to see where we're going. Something flickered in Dan's eyes. Respect, maybe, or recognition. Yes, ma'am. He helped her up onto the seat, then climbed up himself and took the reins. An old horse waited patiently in the traces, a mare with a coat gone gray around the muzzle. This is Bess, Dan said. She's slow, but she's steady. Won't spook even in a blizzard. She looks kind, Margaret said. She is. Kindest soul I know, truth be told. Dan clicked his tongue, and Bess started forward, plodding through the snow with patient determination. They rode in silence for a while. The snow fell steadily, muffling everything, turning the world white and quiet. Margaret could hear her children murmuring to each other in the wagon bed, could hear Jamie's rattling breath, could hear her own heart beating. Mr. Garrett, she said finally. Dan. Yeah, what you said back there about being desperate yourself. How bad is it really? He was quiet for a long moment. The reins sat easy in his hands and Bess plodded on through the snow. Bad, he said finally. Got a loan coming due in 3 months. $800. Don't have the money to pay it. Man named Harrison Thorne's been trying to buy my land for 2 years. He'll get it when the bank forecloses. How much do you owe? $800. Might as well be $8,000. Margaret absorbed this. And you spent your last $3 on me. I did. Why really? Not the pretty speech you gave in there. The real reason. Dan was quiet for so long, Margaret thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, my folks died when I was 16. Bandits raided our ranch, killed them both. My 3 brothers and I split up the land afterward. I got the worst piece. Rocky soil water that dried up half the year too far from town to make regular supply runs easy. Everyone said I was supposed to fail. He shifted the reins to one hand. I didn't fail, though. Built something from nothing. Then I lost most of it. Drought, bad winters. Woman who said she loved me running off with someone richer. His jaw tightened. Everyone's been waiting for me to give up, sell out to Thorne, admit I was beat. But you haven't. No, he looked at her. When I walked into that saloon today, I wasn't planning on bidding on anyone. Came for supplies, heard about the auction, figured I'd watch. Nothing more. What changed? You did. You were standing up there with 5 children, getting mocked by every man in the room, and you didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't make yourself small to try to seem less threatening. You just stood there and took it. Your eyes were saying, I dare you to break me. He turned back to the road. I know that look. I've worn it myself more times than I can count. And I thought maybe 2 people who refuse to break might have a chance together. Maybe. That's a lot of maybes. It is. We might make things worse for each other. I don't know anything about ranching. My children are hungry and one of them is sick. Margaret stopped. You're what? I'm not the woman you probably wanted. I didn't want any woman, Dan said simply. Not for a long time. After Martha left, I figured I was done with that part of life. Then why? Because you're not Martha, he said. Martha looked at this land and saw everything it wasn't. You haven't even seen it yet, and you already asked about books for your children. That tells me something, and what does it tell you? That you're thinking about building, not escaping. That you're planning for a future, not just surviving the present. He glanced at her. That's the kind of person who might be able to make this work. Margaret pulled his coat tighter around herself. The cold was seeping through, but she barely felt it now. I should tell you something, she said. Go ahead. My husband Patrick, he didn't just walk into that blizzard. He walked into it on purpose. Dan didn't react, just kept his eyes on the road. He'd lost everything, Margaret continued. Made bad investments, borrowed from the wrong people. By the time I found out, there was nothing left. He couldn't face it, couldn't face me. So he walked into the snow and left me to deal with the mess. That make you angry? Every single day, the words came out harder than she intended. Every single day I'm angry at him for being weak at myself, for not seeing it sooner at the world, for making this the only option I had left. She took a breath. I'm not a good person, Dan. I'm angry and I'm bitter and I'm so tired I can barely think straight. If you're expecting gratitude or pleasantness. To her surprise, Dan laughed. It was a short sound, rusty from disuse but genuine. Ma'am, Maggie, I don't need pleasant. Pleasant doesn't survive winters out here. I need someone who won't quit. And you just told me you are angry enough to fight the whole world. He shook his head. That's not a weakness. That's fuel. Margaret stared at him. In all her life, no one had ever said her anger was useful. Her mother had called it unladylike. Patrick had called it exhausting. The world had called it inappropriate. You're a strange man, Dan Garrett. Been told that before. It wasn't an insult. Didn't take it as one. They rode on in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now, more companionable. The snow kept falling. Somewhere behind them, Margaret's children had fallen asleep, their breathing soft and steady under the blanket. For the first time in 2 years, Margaret felt something other than despair. She wasn't sure what to call it yet. Not hope. Hope felt too fragile, too likely to shatter. But something. A spark. A possibility. $3 and a stranger's faith. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had this morning. And Margaret Garrett now, was used to building something from nothing. The cabin appeared through the snow like a ghost. Small, dark, hunched against the hillside as if trying to disappear. Margaret's heart sank, but she kept her face still. She'd promised herself she wouldn't show disappointment. Whatever this place was, it was shelter. It was warmth. It was more than her children had now. It ain't much, Dan said quietly as if reading her thoughts. I know. It has walls, Margaret said, and a roof, most of one anyway. Margaret almost laughed. Most of one will do. Dan pulled Bess to a stop and climbed down. His boots crunched in the snow as he came around to help Margaret, then moved to the wagon bed where the children were stirring. Catherine, Ruth, we're here. Catherine sat up, blinking sleep from her eyes. She looked at the cabin, and Margaret watched her daughter's face go through the same journey hers had. Hope, disappointment, acceptance. It's small, Ruth said, not bothering to hide her reaction. Ruth, Margaret's voice was sharp. But it's got a chimney, Ruth added quickly. That means fire, right? I like fire. Dan lifted Jamie from the wagon. The boy was burning up now, his breathing worse than before. Let's get inside, Dan said. I'll start the fire. The interior was exactly what Margaret had expected. One main room with a stone fireplace, a rough table, 2 chairs, everything clean but worn, maintained with the kind of desperate care that spoke of a man holding on by his fingernails. Bedroom's yours, Dan said, settling Jamie into a chair near the cold fireplace. You and the children. I'll sleep out here. This is your home, Margaret protested. We can't take your bed. 5 children need proper sleep, Dan said. He was already kneeling at the fireplace, building a fire with practiced hands. I've slept on worse than a wooden floor. Margaret wanted to argue, but Jamie coughed. That terrible rattling sound that made her chest ache. He's burning up, she said, pressing her hand to his forehead. I know. Dan didn't look up from the fire. Got some willow bark tea that might help. Not much, but it's something. We need a doctor. Nearest doctor's in town. 15 miles in this snow. That's a day's ride each way. Then we go tomorrow, if the storm lets up. Dan got the fire going and stood brushing off his hands. Right now we keep him warm, get fluids in him, and pray. Margaret's jaw tightened. She'd been praying for 2 years. Praying hadn't brought Patrick back. Praying hadn't fed her children. Praying hadn't stopped her from ending up on an auction block. But she nodded anyway because what else could she do? The first night was chaos. 5 children, 1 small cabin, not enough beds, not enough blankets, not enough of anything. Margaret organized them as best she could, Catherine and Ruth sharing the bed with Rose, Benjamin on a pallet on the floor, Jamie closest to the fire where she could watch him. She didn't sleep. She sat in one of the rough chairs watching the flames, listening to her children breathe, waiting for Jamie's cough to turn into something worse. Sometime past midnight, Dan appeared at her side with a cup of tea. "You should rest," he said. "Can't. Your boy's going to need you strong tomorrow." "My boy needs me watching him tonight." Dan was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down in the other chair, stretching his legs toward the fire. "You always this stubborn?" he asked. "Always. My mother called it my worst quality." "Sounds like a wise woman." "She died when I was 12. Consumption." "I'm sorry." Margaret shrugged. "It was a long time ago." They sat in silence. The fire crackled. Jamie coughed in his sleep but didn't wake. "Tell me about the debts," Margaret said finally. "I can't sleep anyway. Might as well know what we're dealing with." Dan rubbed his face with one hand. He looked exhausted, Margaret realized. More exhausted than she'd noticed before. $800, he said, owed to the bank in town. Loan came due 6 months ago, but they gave me an extension. Extension runs out end of March. What happens then? If I can't pay, they foreclose. Harrison Thorne buys the land at auction for pennies on the dollar. He's been waiting for it, circling like a vulture. Who's Thorne? Harrison Thorne owns most of the land in this valley. Wants to own all of it. Dan's voice hardened. My property's got the only creek that doesn't dry up in summer. He needs it for his cattle operation. So he's the villain. He's the man with money and power and no conscience about using either. Margaret absorbed this. $800, 3 months. A powerful enemy waiting for them to fail. What are our assets? She asked. Dan blinked. Our what assets? What do we have? Cattle, equipment, anything we can sell or leverage. I got about 50 head of cattle, Old Bess, and 2 other horses. The cabin, the barn, the land itself. 60 acres. He paused. That's it. No savings. Spent my last $3 today. Financial records, Margaret said, standing. Ledgers, receipts, loan documents. Where do you keep them? Dan stared at her like she'd started speaking another language. I got a notebook where I write things down sometimes. Stack of papers in a drawer. That's about it. Show me. Now. He showed her. The notebook was barely half filled, the handwriting cramped and uncertain. The stack of papers was exactly that, a stack no organization. Receipts mixed with bills, mixed with letters from the bank. Margaret spread everything out on the kitchen table and began sorting. Dan watched her work with something like wonder on his face. You know what you're doing, he said. I kept my father's books from the time I was 12. After my mother died, someone had to. Her hands moved efficiently, creating piles. Income here, expenses there, debts in a third stack. Patrick never let me touch our finances, said it wasn't a woman's concern. How'd that work out? He lost everything and walked into a blizzard. Margaret's voice was flat. So not well. By the time gray light started seeping through the windows, Margaret had a clearer picture of Dan's financial situation. It was worse than he'd told her, but also better in some ways he hadn't seen. You've been paying twice for some things, she said when he brought her coffee. These receipts here, you paid the feed store in September and again in October for the same order. I did. You did. And these charges from the blacksmith don't match your records. Either someone's been cheating you or your math is wrong. Probably both. Dan looked embarrassed. Never was much good with numbers. I am. Margaret tapped the papers into a neat stack. Here's what I know. You owe $800. You have about 50 cattle worth, maybe $20 each if you can get a fair price. That's $1,000 right there. Can't sell all my cattle. Got nothing to rebuild with. I know, but it tells us the assets exist. The problem isn't that you have nothing. It's that the system is designed to keep you from using what you have. She looked at him. Thorne controls the stockyard in town, doesn't he? How'd you know that? Because if you could sell your cattle at fair market value, you wouldn't be in this position. Someone's controlling the price. And in a valley this small with one man trying to buy everyone out. Margaret shook her head. It has to be him. Dan's expression shifted from confusion to anger. That son of a... He stopped himself. Sorry. Don't be, but you're right. Every time you try to sell, the price is lower than it should be. That's not bad timing. That's strategy. He's squeezing you out. So what do? We find another buyer. Someone outside Thorne's control. There isn't anyone else for 100 miles. Then we go 100 miles. Margaret's jaw was set. You said you weren't going to give up. Neither am I. We have 3 months to find $800. That's a lot of time if we use it right. Dan looked at her, really looked at her, and something changed in his face, something softened. You're not what I expected, he said quietly. What did you expect? Someone grateful, I guess. Someone who'd be happy just to have a roof and not ask questions. Do you want me to be that person? No. He shook his head. No, I reckon I don't. Jamie's fever broke on the 3rd day. Margaret had barely slept, barely eaten, spending every moment at her son's side, cooling his forehead with wet cloths, forcing willow bark tea between his lips, praying despite herself. When his eyes finally opened clear and focused and present, she burst into tears. Mama, Jamie's voice was weak but there. Mama, why are you crying? Because you scared me, baby. You scared me so bad. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Just get better. Promise me you'll get better. I promise. Dan appeared in the doorway. He'd been handling everything else while Margaret focused on Jamie, feeding the other children, keeping the fire going, checking on the cattle, doing the work of 2 people without complaint. He's awake, Dan said. He's awake. Margaret wiped her face with her sleeve. His fever's down. Thank God. Thank you. We're partners now, ain't we? That's what partners do. Mr. Dan, Jamie's voice was thin. Are you our new pa? Dan went very still. Margaret held her breath. He crossed the room and knelt beside Jamie's pallet. Up close, Margaret could see the emotion he was trying to hide, the careful way he held himself, the gentleness he didn't want to admit to. I don't know, son, Dan said finally. That's not for me to decide. That's for your mama and for you kids. My other pa went away and didn't come back. I know. Are you going to go away too? Dan was quiet for a long moment. I can't promise you everything's going to be easy. Winter's hard. Life out here is harder. But I can promise you this. I ain't gonna walk away. Whatever happens, I'm going to be here fighting for this ranch, for your mama, for you and your brothers and sisters. Even if it gets really bad. Especially then, Jamie considered this with the gravity of a 6-year-old who'd already learned that adults sometimes lied. Okay, he said finally. I believe you. The blizzard came without warning. Margaret woke to a sound she'd never heard before, a howling so deep it seemed to come from the earth itself. The cabin shook. The windows rattled. And when she pushed open the bedroom door, she found Dan already at the front window, his face grim. How bad? She asked. Bad. He didn't turn around. Worst I've seen in 5 years. We're stuck here for days. The cattle. Pray they found shelter. Nothing I can do for them now. Margaret moved to stand beside him. Through the frost-covered glass, she could see nothing but white. White sky, white ground, white air thick with snow that fell sideways, driven by a wind that sounded like screaming. What do? We survive. Dan finally looked at her. His eyes were worried in a way she hadn't seen before. Got enough wood for maybe 4 days if we're careful, food for a week if we stretch it, and if the storm lasts longer, then we got problems. The first day passed slowly. Margaret kept the children occupied with lessons, reading for the older ones, letters for Rose, arithmetic for Benjamin, who complained constantly but did the work anyway. Dan spent hours at the window watching the storm, checking the fire rationing wood with the careful precision of a man who'd done this before. On the 4th day, Benjamin stopped speaking. Margaret noticed it at breakfast, the way her son ate in silence, the way he wouldn't meet anyone's eyes, the way he flinched when Dan walked past him. Ben, she said, you all right? No answer. Ben, I asked you a question. I'm fine. You don't seem fine. I said I'm fine. He pushed away from the table and retreated to the corner, wrapping his arms around his knees. Margaret started to follow, but Dan caught her arm gently. Let me, he said. He's my son. I know, but I think I know what this is about. Margaret hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to go to her child, but something in Dan's face made her nod. Dan crossed the room and sat down on the floor next to Benjamin. Not too close, just near enough. You know, Dan said conversationally, when I was about your age, my pa used to take me out to check the cattle every morning. Rain or shine, hot or cold. Said it built character. Benjamin didn't respond. I hated it, hated getting up early, hated the cold, hated the work. Mostly I hated that he made me do it when my brothers got to sleep in. Still nothing. Then one day bandits came to our ranch. Killed my ma and pa both. I was 16. Dan's voice was steady, but Margaret could hear the old pain beneath it. After that, I'd have given anything to get up early and check cattle with my father one more time. Benjamin's shoulders tensed. I ain't trying to replace your pa, man, Dan continued. Nobody could do that. He was your father, and losing him, that's a wound that don't heal all the way. I know, because I got the same wound. Finally, Benjamin looked up. His eyes were red. You don't know anything, he said. Maybe not, but I know what it feels like to be angry at someone you love for leaving you. To be angry at yourself for being angry. To want to hate them, but not being able to because they're gone, and hating them feels like betraying their memory. Benjamin's face crumpled. He left us. He just left. I know. He was supposed to protect us. That's what fathers do. They protect their families, and he just walked away. I know. I hate him. The words came out like they'd been locked away for years. I hate him so much, and I miss him so much, and I don't know how to feel both things at the same time. Dan reached out slowly and put his hand on Benjamin's shoulder. The boy didn't pull away. You feel both things because both things are true, Dan said. That's what grief is, holding two impossible feelings at once and not letting either one destroy you. Does it ever stop hurting? No, but it gets easier to carry. Benjamin was crying now, tears streaming down his face. I don't want a new father. I don't want to forget him. You won't forget him, and I ain't asking to be your father. Dan's voice was rough with emotion. But maybe I could be your friend, someone who's got your back when things get hard. Benjamin looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. Okay, friends. Dan smiled. It was a small thing, but real. Friends. Margaret watched from across the room, tears running down her own face. Catherine came up beside her, slipping her hand into her mother's. He's good, Mama, Catherine whispered. Mr. Dan, he's really good. I know, baby, I know. On the 5th day, they ran low on everything: wood, food, patience. The children were climbing the walls, and even Margaret's lessons couldn't hold their attention. The cold seeped in through every crack, and the fire seemed to give less heat no matter how much they fed it. We need more wood, Dan said grimly. Got maybe half a day's worth left. Can you get to the wood pile? Going to have to try. If the storm's died down enough, I can make it to the barn and back. I'll go with you. No. I wasn't asking permission. Dan's jaw tightened. Maggie, it's dangerous. Wind's still bad. You could get lost between here and the barn. Then we tie a rope to the door. I've read about that. Settlers used to do it. You've read about surviving blizzards. I've read about everything. It's how I survived before I got here. She stood. We need wood. You can't carry enough by yourself. I'm going. She could see him wanting to argue, weighing her safety against their survival. Finally, he nodded. All right, but you stay close. You feel my hand, you don't let go. Understand? Understood. They bundled up in every piece of clothing they had. Dan tied a rope around his waist, then around Margaret's, then secured the other end to the doorframe. The children watched with wide eyes. Catherine, you're in charge, Margaret said. Keep the fire going with what we have left. Keep everyone calm. Yes, Mama. We'll be back soon. Promise. Promise. Dan opened the door and the storm hit them like a wall. Margaret gasped. She'd never felt cold like this. Cold that cut through every layer, that stole the breath from her lungs. The snow was blinding, the wind deafening. Dan grabbed her hand. Stay with me. She couldn't speak, could barely see. She just held on and followed, one step at a time. The rope, their lifeline, back to safety. The barn was only 50 feet away, but it felt like miles. They made it, though. Dan found the woodpile by memory, and they loaded their arms with as much as they could carry. Margaret's fingers were numb, her face burning with cold, but she didn't stop. "Enough!" Dan shouted over the wind. "Let's go back." They followed the rope, hand over hand, Margaret clutching the wood against her chest. The cabin door appeared out of the white, and they stumbled inside. Catherine slammed the door behind them. They collapsed on the floor. The children pressed against them on all sides. Dan's hands were blue, and Margaret made him hold them near the flames despite his protests. "That was brave," he said quietly when the children had retreated. "Stupid, but brave. I couldn't let you go alone. I've done it before. That was before you had someone to come back to." Dan looked at her, really looked at her the way he had in the saloon that first day. "Maggie, I know," she cut him off. "I know we barely know each other. I know this is strange and fast and probably foolish. But these past weeks," she stopped trying to find the right words. "You've been more of a partner to me than Patrick ever was. You listen to me. You respect my opinions. You look at my children and see people, not problems. That's just basic decency." "No, it isn't. Trust me." Her voice was fierce. "I spent 6 years married to a man who saw me as decoration, who made decisions without consulting me, who hid things because he didn't think I could handle the truth. You're nothing like that. I ain't exactly a prize, Maggie. Failing ranch mountain of debt, powerful enemy trying to destroy us. I've survived worse." She took his cold hand in hers. "And I'd rather face all of that with you than face anything alone ever again." Dan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "I never thought I'd say this to anyone again. After Martha left, I figured that part of my life was over, but you make me want things I'd stopped wanting. A future, a family, a reason to fight for something beyond just not losing. Then let's fight together. You sure about me about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Margaret leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft, tentative, two people who'd forgotten how to hope learning it again. "I'm sure," she whispered. "I've never been more sure of anything." The storm broke on the 6th day. Margaret woke to silence. No howling wind, no rattling windows, no constant assault of noise, just quiet. Dan was already at the door pulling on his boots. "Storm's past. I need to check the cattle." "I'm coming." "No, stay with the children. If something's wrong, if the cattle are scattered or dead, they shouldn't see that." "Not yet." She wanted to argue, but she saw the fear in his eyes, the desperate need to protect her from whatever waited outside. "All right," she said, "but you come back. You hear me? You come back." "I'll come back. I promise. Wait, gang." She watched him go, trudging through snow that reached his thighs, disappearing into the blinding white of morning sun on fresh powder. An hour passed, then 2, then 3. Catherine joined her at the window. "Mama, where's Mr. Dan?" "Checking on the cattle. The snow's deep. It's slow going." "Shouldn't he be back by now?" "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "Yes, he should." By the time 3 hours had passed, Margaret was pacing the cabin like a caged animal. Catherine watched the children. Margaret bundled up and stepped out into the cold. The world was transformed, white and glittering and beautiful in the way that deadly things sometimes were. She could see Dan's tracks leading toward the pasture, and she followed them, her heart pounding. She found him at the fence line, or what was left of it. He was standing motionless, staring at a gap in the wire that hadn't been there before. The fence was cut, deliberately, cleanly, in a way that weather couldn't explain. "Dan," she said. He didn't turn around. "They're gone, most of them. 20 head at least, maybe more. Chattered during the storm when the fence went down." Margaret moved to stand beside him. Through the gap in the fence, she could see tracks, cattle tracks, disappearing into the wilderness. The storm didn't do this. "No," Dan's voice was hollow. "Thorne had men do it. Probably sent them out just before the blizzard hit. Cut the fence, spooked the cattle, let the storm do the rest." His hands were shaking. "We're finished, Maggie. Without those cattle, there's no way to make the loan payment. No way to save the ranch." Margaret looked at the cut fence, at the tracks, at the man beside her, whose hope was draining away like water from a cracked cup. Something hardened inside her. No, she said. Dan looked at her. No what? No, we're not finished. She grabbed his arm, made him face her. This is what he wants. He wants us to give up, to look at this and decide it's impossible. That's how he wins. Maggie, be realistic. I am being realistic. Realistic is understanding that we still have cattle. 30 head, maybe more if we can find the scattered ones. Realistic is knowing that scattered cattle can be found. Realistic is refusing to let one man destroy us because he thinks he's entitled to everything we have. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. Her voice was fierce. I understand that you've been fighting alone for too long, that you've forgotten what it's like to have someone in your corner. But you're not alone anymore, Dan. You have me. You have 5 children who are counting on us. And I absolutely refuse to tell them that we gave up because some rich man cut a fence. Dan stared at her, the despair in his eyes battling with something that looked like hope. Margaret took his face in her hands. Listen to me, I didn't survive 2 years of hell to give up now. I didn't cross the country with 5 children to watch everything fall apart. And I didn't fall in love with a stubborn, impossible man just to let him quit when things got hard. Dan's breath caught. You love me. I love you. God help me, but I do. So you're going to stop standing here feeling sorry for yourself. You're going to come back to that cabin with me, and we're going to figure out how to save this ranch together. Understand? For a long moment, Dan just looked at her. Then slowly he smiled. Yes, ma'am. Good. Now come on, it's cold out here and we've got work to do. They walked back to the cabin together, hand in hand through the snow. The fence was still cut. The cattle were still scattered. Harrison Thorne was still circling, but for the first time since the storm hit, Margaret felt like they might actually have a chance. Not because the odds had improved. They hadn't. But because they were fighting together now. And together they were stronger than either of them alone. $3 and a leap of faith. It had been enough to get them this far. And Margaret Garrett had a feeling it would be enough to take them all the way. The week after the blizzard, Margaret Brennan Garrett learned what desperation looked like when it wore someone else's face. She and Dan rode out to Grace Mitchell's ranch on a cold afternoon when the sky hung low and gray, leaving the children with Mrs. Crawford in town. The woman had surprised Margaret by offering, without being asked, her usual frown softening just enough to show something human underneath. Grace Mitchell's adobe house sat at the edge of her property like a monument to stubborn survival. Small but well-maintained despite obvious hardship. When the door opened and Grace appeared, weathered face framed by iron gray hair, Margaret saw recognition flash in those sharp eyes. Joseph Garrett, Grace said. Been a while. Grace, this is my wife Maggie. Grace's gaze moved to Margaret, assessing in the way women do when measuring another woman's worth. The whole valley heard. $3, wasn't it? That's right, Margaret said, keeping her voice steady. Something like respect flickered across Grace's face. Takes courage to come out here asking for help when you got nothing to bargain with. We're not asking for charity, Margaret said. We're asking for alliance. Grace was quiet for a moment, then stepped aside. Come in. I'll make coffee. The interior was sparse but clean. A crucifix hung on one wall. A faded photograph of a man, dark-haired and smiling, sat on a small table near the window. Grace caught Margaret looking. Miguel was a good man, Grace said, her voice flat with the kind of grief that had settled into bone. Best man I ever knew. Harrison Thorne killed him. Can you prove it? Margaret asked. No, that's the hell of it. I know it in my bones, but I can't prove a damn thing. Grace poured coffee with hands that trembled slightly. Steam rose between them like smoke signals. His men spooked our cattle during Roundup 3 years ago. Miguel got trampled trying to control the herd. Everyone called it an accident. Sheriff wrote it up as an accident. Thorne sent flowers to the funeral. But you don't believe that, Dan said. Miguel had been working cattle since he was 10 years old. He knew how to handle a stampede. He knew how to read animals, knew when they were spooked, natural, and when something was wrong. Grace's jaw tightened. Something scared those animals. Something deliberate. She set down her cup hard enough that coffee sloshed over the rim. Week before it happened, Thorne offered to buy our water rights. Miguel refused. Week after the funeral, Thorne offered again. Lower price. Said it would help me with the expenses with being alone. Did you sell? Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. I told him to go to hell. Grace's smile was fierce and terrible. He's been trying to squeeze me out and ever since. Cut off my credit at the supply store. Bought the note on my fence repairs. Had the bank raise my interest rates twice. But I'm still here. Stubborn, I reckon. We need people like you, Margaret said, leaning forward. Stubborn people. People who won't roll over just because Harrison Thorne tells them to. What exactly are you proposing? Margaret pulled out the ledger she'd been compiling, pages covered in her neat script. Thorne's been hurting ranchers in this valley for years, cutting fences, manipulating prices, buying judges and bankers. But he's only able to do it because everyone's too scared to stand together. And you think you can change that? I think if enough people tell their stories, document his crimes, we can take it to the territorial governor. Someone outside Thorne's influence. Grace laughed, but there was no humor in it. The territorial governor. You know, how many people have been tried to go over Thorne's head? How many went on? Two that I know of. One lost his ranch in a fire 6 months later. The other just disappeared one day. Wife came home, found his horse in the stable, but no sign of him. They found his body in the spring thaw, miles from where he should have been. Margaret felt Dan tense beside her, but she kept her voice steady. That was when they went alone. What if they'd had witnesses, documentation, a group of people all telling the same story? Then Thorne would have to burn down a lot of ranches, Grace said slowly, or make a lot of people disappear. Exactly, there's safety in numbers. He can't destroy all of us without drawing attention he can't control. Grace stared into her coffee cup like she was looking for answers there. My son Diego, he's 19. Good boy, works harder than most men twice his age. If I do this, if I stand against Thorne publicly, I'm putting him at risk. I know, Margaret said quietly. You got children too. 5 of them. Yes. And you're still willing to fight. I'm willing to fight because I have children, Margaret said, because I refuse to teach them that bullies always win, that the right thing to do is roll over and accept defeat when someone powerful decides they want what's yours. She met Grace's eyes. I've lost everything before. My husband, my home, my hope. I rebuilt once. I can do it again if I have to, but I won't go down without a fight. Grace studied her for a long moment. Then she stood and called toward the back room. Diego, saddle the horses. We're riding out. Ma. A young man appeared in the doorway, tall and dark-haired, with his mother's fierce eyes. Mrs. Garrett here has an idea. Might be crazy, might get us all killed. Grace's smile was grim, but it's better than dying slow. 3 days later, they gathered at Grace Mitchell's barn. Not a private meeting between allies, but something bigger. 11 ranching families crowded into the space meant for hay and horses, their breath clouding in the cold air. Thomas Gray, who'd lost half his herd to a mysterious illness the week after refusing Thorne's offer. Martha Chen, whose barn had burned the day after she outbid Thorne for land at auction. Jacob Thornton, driven to the edge of bankruptcy by inflated supply costs. Samuel Wright, whose eldest son had been beaten half to death by men who were never caught. Margaret stood before them with Dan at her side and the ledger in her hands, and she felt the weight of their skepticism like a physical thing. Here's what we know, she said, her voice carrying in the barn's acoustics. Harrison Thorne has been systematically destroying ranchers in this valley for at least 5 years. He's used sabotage, price manipulation, intimidation, and probably worse. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Each of us alone doesn't have enough evidence to prove anything. But together we have a pattern, a clear record of his crimes. She held up the ledger. I've documented every incident I could find. Dates, losses, witnesses. This is enough to demand an investigation. Investigation by who? Jacob Thornton's voice was skeptical, worn down by years of losing. The sheriff's in Thorne's pocket. The mayor owes him money. The bank manager does whatever Thorne tells him. The territorial governor isn't, Margaret said. Neither is the federal marshal's office. We're not just talking about local crimes. We're talking about fraud, conspiracy, possibly murder. That's federal territory. You know how to reach the federal marshal? Martha Chen asked. No, but I know how to write a letter that'll make him want to reach us. Samuel Wright shifted his weight, the movement sending dust motes dancing through the lamplight. This is dangerous. Thorne doesn't take kindly to people standing against him. My boy, he can barely walk right anymore after what happened to him. He's already destroying us one by one, Margaret said. At least this way we fight back. Thomas Gray stood slowly. He was older than the others, face carved deep with lines of loss and endurance. My grandfather came to this territory with nothing but a wagon and a rifle, built his ranch from bare ground. My father expanded it, added the south pasture, dug the well that still runs clean. I was supposed to pass it to my children, teach them the way I was taught. His voice cracked slightly. Thorne's taking that from me, taking it like he's got some God-given right to everything in this valley. He tried to take it. Grace stepped forward. You're still here. We're all still here. For now, Thomas said. For now is all any of us have, Margaret said. Every day we're still fighting is a victory. Every mile we cover is proof that he doesn't own us. The barn fell silent, except for the wind outside and the soft sounds of horses shifting in their stalls. Margaret took a breath and spoke from somewhere deeper than strategy. I know what it feels like to lose everything. 2 years ago, I had a home, a husband, and a future. I lost it all in one night when Patrick walked into a blizzard and didn't come back. She paused, feeling Dan's presence beside her like an anchor. And I thought my life was over. I thought there was nothing left but survival, just putting one foot in front of the other until something finished me off. But it wasn't over. It was the beginning of something else, something harder, but more real. I found strength I didn't know I had. I found people who saw my value when I'd stopped seeing it myself. Her eyes found Dan's across the lamplight. I found love I'd stopped believing in. So when I say we're still fighting, I mean it. Not because I'm naive about the odds. Not because I think winning is guaranteed, but because fighting is the only way forward. And forward is the only direction that matters. Grace raised her cup of coffee like a toast. To fighting. The others echoed it one by one, the words spreading through the barn like a quiet prayer. To fighting. They talked for another hour. Margaret outlined the plan. Every family would write down their story, every detail they could remember. They would compile it, all made copies, send one to the territorial governor, one to the federal marshal, one to the newspapers in Cheyenne. The newspapers, Thomas Gray asked. Why, public pressure, Margaret said. Thorne's power depends on people being afraid to speak. Once his crimes are public knowledge, that power shrinks. Men like him can survive in darkness. They can't survive in light. Dan spoke up, then his voice quiet but carrying weight. There's something else we need to discuss. The cattle. Every head turned toward him. My fence was cut during the blizzard, Dan said. Lost at least 20 heads scattered into the wilderness. But I still have about 30. And I'm guessing some of you lost cattle too, but still have some left. Hands went up. More than half the people in the barn. Thorne did the same thing to all of us, Dan continued. Cut fences, spooked herds, let the storm do his dirty work. Some of those cattle are still out there scattered but alive. If we work together, pool our resources, we might be able to round them up. That's a lot of ground to cover, Thomas said. It is, but we've got a lot of people. Margaret stepped forward again. There's more. Thorne controls the stockyard in town. That's how he keeps prices low. He's the only buyer, so he sets the terms. But there's a cattle buyer in Cheyenne who pays fair market value. If we can get our cattle there. Cheyenne's 100 miles away, Thomas interrupted. I know. A cattle drive in winter through mountain passes. He shook his head. That's suicide. It's a chance, Margaret said. Maybe our only one. Thorne's expecting us to sell through his stockyard at his prices. He's expecting us to slowly bleed out until we have no choice but to accept his offers. But if we bypass him entirely, he'll try to stop us, Martha Chen said quietly. Dan's voice went hard. Let him try and I'm done letting that man dictate my life. Done waiting for him to finish what he started. If we're going to lose everything anyway, I'd rather lose it fighting. The silence that followed was different now, charged with something dangerous and fragile. Hope maybe, or the memory of what hope used to feel like. Not everyone could commit. Some had families they couldn't leave. Some had cattle too scattered to gather in time. But enough said yes. Grace and her son Diego, Thomas Gray, Martha Chen, Samuel Wright's eldest son Jacob recovered enough to ride. Two brothers named Henry and William Cole, who'd been losing ground to Thorne for 3 years. 9 riders total, not counting Dan and Margaret. We leave in 3 days, Dan said. That gives us time to round up what cattle we can find, make preparations. Anyone who can't ride can help with the documentation, Margaret added. Get those letters ready to send. The meeting broke up slowly, people lingering to talk in small groups. The energy in the barn different than when they'd arrived. Dangerous, yes, but alive in a way that defeat never was. Grace pulled Margaret aside as the others were leaving. You know what you're doing, girl? No, Margaret said honestly, but I'm doing it anyway. That's either the bravest or the stupidest thing I ever heard. Maybe both. Grace smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. Miguel would have liked you. He always said the best people were the ones too stubborn to know when they were beat. The morning before the cattle drive, Harrison Thorne came to the ranch. Margaret saw him first, a figure on horseback emerging from the tree line, the early sun behind him, turning him into a silhouette. 4 other riders followed at a respectful distance. Her stomach dropped like a stone. Dan, she called. He was already moving, positioning himself between the approaching riders and the cabin where the children were eating breakfast. His hand didn't go to his gun, but the possibility hung in the air like smoke. I will not hide, Margaret said, coming to stand beside him. Maggie, please. I said I will not hide. Harrison Thorne rode closer. Up close, he was not what Margaret had imagined. Where Dan was rough-hewn and weathered, Thorne was polished. Expensive coat, clean boots, gray hair carefully combed. He looked like a Boston businessman, not a Wyoming cattle baron. That somehow made him more frightening. Garrett, Thorne said, pulling his horse to a stop a few feet away. Mrs. Garrett, I heard you've been busy. News travel fast, Dan said flatly. In a valley this small, everything travels fast. Thorne's gaze swept over the ranch, taking in the mended fences, the cattle gathered in the near pasture, the supplies stacked by the barn. All the signs of preparation. Planning a trip, I see. That's our business. Ah, but you're making it everyone's business, aren't you? Thorne's smile was pleasant, but his eyes were cold. Riding around, stirring up trouble. Convincing good people to join your little crusade against me. Dan's hand moved slightly toward his gun. Say what you came to say. I came to give you one last chance. Thorne shifted in his saddle leather, creaking. Walk away. Take my offer. I'll even raise it to $1,000. That's more than fair for land that's about to be foreclosed on anyway. Take the money, start fresh somewhere else. No one has to get hurt. And if we don't, then things become unpleasant. Thorne's voice didn't change. Still pleasant, still reasonable. For everyone. His eyes slid to Margaret, lingering just long enough to make his meaning clear. A cattle drive through mountain passes in winter, he continued. Dangerous territory. Things can happen. Accidents. He paused, smile widening. Especially when there are children involved. My men saw your daughter practicing her riding yesterday. Catherine isn't at 14 years old. Far too young for such a dangerous journey. Margaret's blood went cold. He knew. He'd been watching them. He knew Catherine planned to ride with them. Dan stepped forward, his whole body tense as a drawn bowstring. Are you threatening my wife? I'm stating facts. Thorne's 4 men shifted hands, moving toward their weapons. A woman and children on a 100-mile cattle drive in this weather. That's not a threat, Garrett. That's just acknowledging reality. You shoot me, and my men shoot you both. Then what happens to those 5 children inside? Margaret's mind was racing. He was trying to provoke them, trying to give himself an excuse, but there had to be another way. Mr. Thorne, she said, stepping between the 2 men, you're a businessman. Let's talk business. Thorne's eyebrows rose. Now that's interesting. You want this land for the water rights. That's your primary objective, correct? Correct, among other things. Then let's negotiate. Margaret kept her voice steady even though her heart was hammering. Give us 6 months. If we can't make the loan payment by then, we'll sell to you at your original offer, $500. Maggie, Dan's voice was strangled. What are you, She cut him off with a look. But if we do make the payment, you leave us alone, permanently. No more sabotage, no more price manipulation, no more threats. Thorne studied her like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. You're offering me worse terms than I already have. In 3 months, the bank forecloses and I get the land for less. But that's uncertain, Margaret said. Banks can be unpredictable. Loans can be renegotiated. Things can change. I'm offering you a guarantee. We fail, you win. Clean and simple. And if you succeed, then you've lost nothing but time. You've still got your empire. We've still got our tiny ranch. Everyone goes home. Thorne was quiet for a long moment. Margaret could feel Dan vibrating with tension beside her, could sense Thorne's men waiting for a signal. 6 months, Thorne said finally. But understand this. If I even suspect you're going to the authorities, if I hear one word about federal marshals or territorial governors, the deal's off, and the consequences will be severe. Understood, Margaret said. I don't think you do understand. Not really. Thorne gathered his reins. I've spent 20 years building what I have. I won't let a $3 bride and a failing rancher take it away from me. He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following. Margaret watched them go, her heart still pounding, hands shaking now that the danger had passed. What the hell was that? Dan's voice was barely controlled. You just promised him the ranch. I promised him the ranch if we fail, Margaret said. And we're not going to fail. You bargained our future. I saved our lives. Her voice cracked. Right here, right now. He would have killed us, Dan. Made it look like an accident. I saw it in his eyes, so I bought time. I saved our children's lives. Because dead parents can't fight for anything. Dan stared at her, the anger slowly draining from his face, replaced by understanding. You're right. You're right, I wasn't thinking. No, you were being brave. Stupid brave. Margaret's hands were still shaking. I love that about you. But it was going to get us killed. So what now? Now we do exactly what we planned. We round up the cattle. We drive them to Cheyenne. We sell them at fair market value. She took a breath. And we send those letters anyway. But you promised. I promised not to go to the authorities if he left us alone. He threatened our children, Dan. He's not going to leave us alone. Her jaw tightened. We just needed time. Now we have it. 6 months instead of 3. Dan shook his head slowly, something like awe in his expression. You're terrifying. You know that. I learned from the best. She looked toward the cabin where 5 faces were pressed against the window watching. Let's get inside. We've got a cattle drive to plan. That night, after the children were asleep, Margaret wrote 3 letters by lamplight. 1 to the territorial governor, 1 to the federal marshal's office, 1 to the Cheyenne newspaper. Each contained a summary of Harrison Thorne's crimes, names of witnesses, dates, and details carefully documented. She sealed them and gave them to Grace Mitchell, who came by after dark. Diego will mail these from a town 50 miles away, Grace said, tucking the letters into her coat. Far enough that Thorne's spies won't see. This is dangerous, Margaret said. If he finds out, then we're no worse off than we were before, Grace replied. But if it works, if even one of those letters reaches someone who cares, it could change everything. You really believe that? I believe in trying. Sometimes that's all we have. Grace disappeared into the darkness, carrying letters that could save them or destroy them. Margaret stood there until Grace vanished from sight, then went inside to her family. To the man she loved and the children who depended on her. To the impossible fight they'd chosen to wage. Tomorrow the cattle drive would begin. Tomorrow everything would change. But tonight they had each other. And that was enough. The morning came cold and clear, the sky, that pale winter blue that promised brutal temperatures. Margaret stood in the ranch yard with Catherine beside her, watching Dan and Diego finish loading the last of the supplies into the wagon. 32 head of cattle milled in the near pasture. Dan's remaining 30 plus 2 from Grace's scattered herd that Diego had managed to recover. Not enough to save everyone, but enough to make a difference. Enough to be worth fighting for. Mama, Ruth said from the cabin doorway, Rose clinging to her skirt. Do you really have to go? Margaret knelt down and pulled her daughters close. I do, sweetheart. But Mr. Dan and I will come back. I promise we'll come back. But what if something happens? Ruth's voice was small. What if the bad man hurts you? Then Catherine will take care of you, and Ben will help, and you'll all be strong together until we get back. She kissed Ruth's forehead, then Rose's. Can you be strong for me? I can be strong, Ruth said, trying to make her voice firm. Rose just nodded, thumb in her mouth. Benjamin appeared from the barn, looking impossibly young but standing tall. At 9 years old, he was about to take on the responsibility Margaret was giving him. Ben, she called, come here. He came chin up, trying to look older than he was. I need you to be this man of the house while we're gone, Margaret said. That means keeping the records like we talked about, making sure Ruth and Jamie and Rose do their lessons, helping Mrs. Crawford with anything she needs. Can you do that? Yes, Mama. I know it's a lot to ask. I can do it. His voice was firm. I'm not scared anymore. Not like I was. Margaret saw Dan standing behind Benjamin, saw the pride in Dan's eyes. Her husband had spent hours with her son over the past week teaching him not with words, but with actions. How to check the remaining cattle, how to split firewood, how to fix a loose board. All the small skills that added up to survival. Mr. Dan says a man takes care of his family, Benjamin continued. So that's what I'm going to do. Margaret felt tears threatening but blinked them back. Your papa would be proud of you. You think so? I know so. Jamie emerged from the cabin, still pale from his illness, but stronger now. He walked straight to Dan and held out his hand like he'd seen men do. Mr. Dan, he said seriously, you take care of my mama. Dan shook the small hand with equal seriousness. I will, Jamie. You have my word. And you come back. We'll come back. Catherine was saying goodbye to her siblings, her face composed, but her hands shaking slightly. At 14, she was about to take on a responsibility most grown men would balk at. 100-mile cattle drive in winter. Margaret had lain awake for hours the night before questioning whether she should allow it. But Catherine had made her case with calm logic. Mama, you need riders. I can ride as well as anyone. And if I stay behind, I'll just worry. At least if I'm with you, I'll know what's happening. Now watching her daughter check her saddle one final time, Margaret felt a fierce pride mixed with terror. Ready? Dan asked, riding up beside her. No, Margaret said honestly, but let's go anyway. They mounted up. Margaret on a sturdy mare named Penny, Catherine on a smaller gelding called Scout, Dan on his own horse, a big bay that had carried him through 5 Wyoming winters. The other riders appeared from the direction of town. Grace and Diego, Thomas Gray moving stiffly but determined, Martha Chen tough as weathered leather, Jacob Wright, Samuel's eldest son, still bearing scars from his beating but refusing to stay behind. The Cole brothers, Henry and William, identical twins, who finished each other's sentences. 9 riders for 32 head of cattle, 100 miles to Cheyenne, 6, maybe 7 days if the weather held. And somewhere behind them, Harrison Thorne's men would be watching, waiting for an opportunity. Dan rode to the front of the small herd and raised his hand. Let's move them out. The cattle began to move slowly at first, then finding their rhythm. Margaret took her position on the left flank, Catherine on the right. The others spread out, experienced riders, finding their places without needing to be told. Margaret looked back one last time. Benjamin standing tall in the ranch yard, Ruth and Rose beside him, Jamie waving. Mrs. Crawford on the porch, her severe face softened just enough to show concern. Then she turned forward toward Cheyenne, toward whatever waited ahead. The first day was brutal in ways Margaret hadn't anticipated. Not the cold, though it was bitter. Not the cattle, though they were stubborn and prone to scatter. But her own body screaming protest at every movement. She'd ridden before, of course, but never like this. Never for hours on end, never through snow that sometimes reached the horses' bellies, never with so much depending on every mile covered. By midday, her legs were shaking. By afternoon, she could barely feel her hands. By evening, when they finally stopped to make camp in a shallow valley, she could barely dismount without Dan's help. Easy, he murmured, catching her as her legs nearly buckled. I've got you. I'm fine, she lied. You're exhausted. We all are. Catherine slid off her horse with enviable grace, moving to help Grace set up the camp. The girl had handled the ride better than Margaret, sitting straighter, moving with the horse instead of fighting it. Pride and jealousy warred in Margaret's chest. They'd covered perhaps 12 miles. At this rate, the journey would take 8 days, maybe 9. Too long, too much exposure to weather and to Thorne's men who would surely be following by now. That night, huddled around a small fire with the cattle bedded down nearby, the riders shared the food they'd brought. Dried beef, hard bread, coffee that tasted like mud, but warmed from the inside out. First watch, Dan said. I'll take it. Diego, you're second. Thomas third. I can take a watch, Margaret said. You can barely stand, Grace pointed out, not unkindly. Rest while you can. Tomorrow will be harder. She was right. Margaret knew she was right. But lying in her bedroll with Catherine beside her and the stars wheeling overhead, she couldn't sleep. Every sound made her jerk awake. The cattle shifting, the horses snorting, the wind in the sparse trees. And once, just before dawn, another sound. Hoofbeats in the distance. She sat up, heart pounding, but when she looked toward where Dan stood watch, he was already staring in that direction. His hand rested on his rifle, but he didn't raise it. The sound faded. Could have been wild horses. Could have been Thorne's men scouting, watching, waiting. Could have been nothing at all. The second day they covered 15 miles, pushing harder despite the exhaustion. The cattle were settling into the rhythm of the drive, moving together instead of fighting at every step. But Margaret could see the toll it was taking on all of them. Thomas Gray's face was gray with pain by noon, his old injuries protesting the long hours in the saddle. Martha Chen's lips were cracked and bleeding from the cold. Even the Cole brothers, young and strong, moved stiffly when they dismounted for the midday rest. And Catherine. Margaret watched her daughter with a mother's keen eye, looking for signs of weakness, of regret. But Catherine sat her horse with quiet determination, her face set in lines that reminded Margaret painfully of her own reflection. That afternoon, Margaret rode alongside Grace for a while. Your girl's doing good, Grace said, nodding toward Catherine. She is. You worried about her. Every second. That's what it means to be a mother, I reckon. Constant worry. Grace shifted in her saddle. Miguel and I never had children. He wanted them, but it just never happened. Sometimes I'm grateful for that. No children to mourn him. No children to put in danger now. But also no children to fight for, Margaret said quietly. Also that. They rode in silence for a while, the only sound the creak of leather and the soft lowing of the cattle. Can I ask you something? Grace said finally. Of course, Vern. Why are you really doing this? Not the ranch, not the money, the real reason. Margaret thought about the question. About Patrick walking into a blizzard because he couldn't face his failures. About standing on that auction platform worth $3. About Benjamin's anger and Jamie's illness and Catherine growing up too fast. Because I'm tired of men like Harrison Thorne deciding what happens to people like us, she said. Because I want my children to see that sometimes you fight even when you know you might lose. Because she stopped searching for the right words. Because Patrick taught them that the world was cruel and there was no point fighting it. I want to teach them something different. Grace nodded slowly. Miguel used to say the same thing. That the world was only as cruel as we let it be. That good people staying quiet was the same as bad people winning. He sounds like he was a wise man. He was, and Thorne killed him anyway. Grace's voice was flat. Wisdom doesn't stop bullets, doesn't stop stampedes. But maybe if enough of us had stood together, then Miguel would still be alive now. The third day brought the riders Margaret had spotted that first night. 4 men on horseback, visible on a ridge about half a mile away. Too far to identify, but close enough to make their presence known. Thorne's men, Margaret asked, riding up beside Dan. Most likely. What do we do? Keep moving. Don't show fear. They're trying to scare us, make us doubt, make us turn back. Is it working? Dan looked at her, then at the herd still plodding forward, at the riders around them, tired but determined. At Catherine handling the cattle with growing confidence. No, he said. I don't think it is. The men followed them all day, maintaining their distance, never approaching, but never leaving. By evening, when they made camp in another valley, Margaret could see the distant glow of their campfire on the ridge above. They're not even hiding, Jacob Wright said, anger making his voice tight. Don't need to, Thomas Gray replied. They know, we know they're there. That's the point of it. That night, they posted 2 guards instead of 1. Dan took first watch with Diego. Margaret tried to sleep but couldn't, knowing Dan was out there in the dark with Thorne's men somewhere above. She must have dozed eventually because she woke to gunfire. The sound cracked through the night like lightning, and Margaret was on her feet before she was fully conscious. All around her, chaos erupted, cattle bellowing in panic, horses screaming, people shouting. Catherine, Margaret's first thought, her only thought. Catherine, I'm here, Mama. Her daughter's voice came from near the wagon. I'm okay. More shots. Margaret couldn't tell who was shooting or from where. She grabbed Catherine and pulled her behind the wagon, both of them crouching in the snow. Stay down, Margaret hissed. Don't move. The gunfire stopped as suddenly as it had started. In the ringing silence that followed, Margaret heard someone groan. Dan, she called into the darkness. Dan. I'm okay. His voice came from the edge of camp. But Thomas is hit. Margaret ran toward the sound, Catherine following despite orders. They found Dan kneeling beside Thomas Gray, pressing his hands against the older man's shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers, black in the moonlight. How bad? Margaret asked, dropping to her knees beside them. Bad enough. Dan's face was grim. Bullet went clean through, but he's losing blood fast. Thomas's eyes found Margaret's. Even in pain, even bleeding, there was steel in his gaze. Keep moving, he rasped. Don't stop for me. Mr. Gray, I didn't come this far to be the reason we fail. He grabbed her hand with surprising strength. You keep those cattle moving, Mrs. Garrett. You get them to Cheyenne. That's all that matters now. Grace appeared beside them, her face set in hard lines. I'll stay with Thomas. Diego can take my place with the herd. You go. All of you. Grace, I can't ask you to. You're not asking, I'm telling. Grace's voice was fierce. Go save our ranches. Make this mean something. Thomas's eyes were closing. Go, he whispered, before those bastards regroup. Margaret looked at Dan, saw the same impossible choice reflected in his eyes. They could stay, tend to Thomas properly, maybe save his life. Or they could go keep the cattle moving, keep the mission alive. There was no good answer. There never had been. We'll send help back, Margaret promised, the moment we reach Cheyenne. I know you will, Grace said. Now go, please. They moved out before dawn, leaving Grace and Thomas behind with 2 horses and enough supplies to survive a few days. The herd was smaller now. They'd lost 6 head in the chaos scattered into the darkness. 26 cattle remaining, 7 riders instead of 9, 60 miles still to go. Margaret rode beside Catherine as the sun came up, painting the snow golden pink. Her daughter's face was pale, strained, but she sat her horse without complaint. Mama, Catherine said quietly, are we doing the right thing? Leaving them. I don't know, baby. I honestly don't know. But sometimes there is no right thing. Sometimes there's just the thing that gives us the best chance. That's scary. It is. Margaret reached across the space between their horses and briefly squeezed her daughter's hand. But you know what? I'm glad you came. I'm glad you're here with me. Really, really, you showed me something these past few days. You showed me that I don't have to protect you from everything, that you're strong enough to face hard things and come out the other side. Catherine's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Papa always said the world was cruel. It can be, but it can also be beautiful and brave and full of people worth fighting for. Margaret looked around at the riders who'd risked everything to be here. Your papa only saw the cruelty. He couldn't see the rest. But you can. I'm learning to, Catherine said, thanks to you. They rode on through the morning, putting distance between themselves and the attack, between themselves and the impossible choice they'd made. The men on the ridge were gone, either satisfied with the night's work or regrouping for another attempt. Either way, there was nothing to do but keep moving forward. By midday on the 4th day, they reached the Sweetwater River. Normally, it would be fordable, a shallow crossing that posed little challenge. But the winter had built up ice along the edges, and the current ran swift and dark between the frozen banks. Diego rode ahead to scout, coming back with his face grim. It's not frozen solid. We can cross, but it's dangerous. Horses might make it. Cattle. He shook his head. Some will struggle. Do we have a choice? Dan asked. We can go around. Adds a day, maybe more. We don't have a day, Margaret said. Thorne's men are probably 6 hours behind us at most. Dan looked at the river, then at the riders, then at Margaret. Then we cross. He went first, testing the depth and current. His horse plunged into the water, flinching at the cold, but made it across. Dan turned and waved them forward. "Single file," he shouted. "Keep them moving. Don't let them stop in the middle." One by one, the riders pushed cattle into the water. The animals bellowed, terrified of the cold and current, but the pressure from behind kept them moving. Margaret was halfway across water, lapping at her stirrups, when she heard Catherine scream, "Mama!" Margaret's head whipped around. Catherine's horse had stumbled on the rocky bottom, going down to its knees. Catherine was thrown forward, hitting the water hard. The current caught her, immediately pulling her downstream. Margaret didn't think. She spurred her horse toward her daughter, not caring that she was leaving her position, not caring about anything except reaching Catherine before the river took her. She saw Catherine's head go under, saw her surface, gasping, arms flailing, saw her go under again. Margaret kicked free of her stirrups and dove into the water. The cold was shocking, stealing her breath, turning her limbs to lead. But she fought it, fought. The current fought everything to reach her daughter. Her hand closed around fabric, Catherine's coat. She pulled hard, bringing her daughter's head above water. But the current was dragging them both now, pulling them away from the crossing, away from safety. "Rope!" Someone was shouting from the bank. "Throw them a rope!" Something hit the water near Margaret's head. A rope. She grabbed for it, one-handed, the other arm locked around Catherine, and caught it. The pull nearly tore her shoulder from its socket. But then they were moving towards shore instead of away, Diego and the Cole brothers, hauling them in hand over hand. They collapsed on the frozen mud of the bank, both coughing, shaking violently from the cold. "Get these wet clothes off." Dan was there, stripping off his own coat. "Now, before hypothermia sets in." Hands pulled at Margaret's clothes, wrapped her in blankets, built an emergency fire despite their exposure. Through it all, she held Catherine, making sure her daughter was breathing, was warm, was alive. "Mama saved my life," Catherine said through chattering teeth. "Your mama's been saving lives since the day I met her," Dan replied, wrapping another blanket around them both. They'd lost 3 more cattle in the crossing, drowned or swept away. 23 head remaining. Not enough. Even at fair market value, 23 head wouldn't be enough to pay. The debt wouldn't be enough to save all the ranches represented here. But they were still moving forward, still fighting. That night, around a fire built in defiance of wisdom and safety, Margaret sat between a Dan and Catherine and felt the weight of what they'd lost, what they stood to lose, what they were still fighting for. 30 miles left, Dan said quietly. 2 days if we push hard. "Can we push that hard?" Margaret asked. "We have to." Diego appeared out of the darkness, sitting down across the fire. "Grace gave me the letters before we left Thomas," he said quietly. "I mailed them this morning from a settlement we passed. Federal marshal, territorial governor, Cheyenne newspaper. They're all on their way." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. "Thank you, Diego." "Miguel was my stepfather," Diego said, "but he was the only father I ever knew. If these letters help bring Thorne down, it's the least I can do." Grace might not have been with them, but her spirit was. The letters were sent. The truth was on its way. Now all they had to do was survive long enough to see it through. 2 more days, Margaret said. 30 more miles, and then we see if this crazy plan works. "And if it doesn't," Martha asked, "then at least we'll go down fighting." Dan reached over and took her hand. That's all anyone can ask for. They rode out before dawn, pushing the cattle hard, despite the exhaustion, despite the cold, despite everything. The animals were tired. The riders were tired. But quitting now would make everything that came before meaningless. By noon, they could see Cheyenne in the distance. Buildings rising from the plains like a promise. Smoke from chimneys. The distant sound of a train whistle. Civilization. Safety. The end of the journey. "We made it," Catherine breathed. "Almost," Margaret said. "Let's not celebrate until the cattle are sold and the money's in our hands." But even she felt hope rising in her chest, dangerous and intoxicating. They'd done it. Against all odds, through blizzards and attacks in rivers, in exhaustion, they'd done it. The question now was whether it would be enough. Margaret looked back at the trail they'd left behind, at the 100 miles of snow and blood and impossible choices, at everything they'd sacrificed to get here. Then she looked forward toward Cheyenne, toward whatever came next. Beside her, Dan sat tall in his saddle, and Catherine did the same. 7 riders and 23 head of cattle arriving at the stockyard like survivors of a war, which Margaret supposed they were. The Cheyenne stockyard smelled like money and manure, the familiar scent of cattle business mixed with the sharper smell of coal smoke from the trains that brought civilization this far west. Margaret sat her horse at the edge of the pens and watched men move cattle with the efficient brutality of those who'd done it 10,000 times before. But if her Dan was stone-faced, but she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. 23 head of cattle, everything they had left, everything that stood between them and losing it all. A man in a wool coat approached his boots clean, despite the mud everywhere else. He had the look of someone who did business in offices, not barns. "You the folks who drove cattle in from Bitter Creek?" "We are," Dan said. "Heard about your drive. News travels." The man's eyes swept over their group. 7 exhausted riders, cattle that had clearly been through hell. "I'm Harrison. I buy for the Chicago markets." "Can you give us a fair price?" Margaret asked. Harrison walked around the cattle, examining them with a practiced eye. He noted their condition, their weight, the way some of them still favored legs bruised in the river crossing. When he came back, his face was neutral. 23 head. Good condition, considering what they've been through. "I can give you market price. $25 a head." Margaret did the math instantly. 23 times 25. $575. Not enough. The loan was $800, and with interest and late fees, the bank would claim she owed $900 or more. Her heart sank, but she kept her face still. They hadn't come this far to give up now. "That's for these cattle," she said carefully, "but we represent 11 ranches. Combined, we could supply you with 100 head or more in the spring." Harrison's eyes lit up with interest. 100 head. "If you're willing to work with us. Direct sale, fair prices, no middlemen." "No middlemen," meaning no local stockyards. Harrison studied her. "You're trying to bypass someone with local power." "We're trying to survive," Margaret said simply. Harrison was quiet for a moment, weighing something in his mind. Then he smiled slowly. "I like direct dealing. Cuts out the people who skim profit without adding value. Tell you what, what was your name?" "Garrett, Margaret Garrett." "Mrs. Garrett, I'll give you 25 a head for these cattle. That's $575. And I'll write you a contract for spring delivery at market rate. Guaranteed purchase of 100 head minimum. And in advance," Margaret pressed, knowing this was her only chance. "Something we can use as collateral at the bank," Harrison considered. $200. "That's my final offer. $775 total. $575 cash today, $200 on contract." Still not enough. They needed at least $900 to satisfy the bank, but it was closer than they'd been this morning. "We'll take it," Margaret said. Papers were signed, money changed hands. Margaret held the cash and the contract like they were holy relics because, in a way, they were. Not salvation, but a fighting chance. The other riders crowded around when Harrison left. "How much?" Diego asked. $775 total. $575 in Wishy. Jacob Wright whistled low. "That's not quite enough, is it?" "No," Margaret admitted. "We're still short, but we have leverage now, a contract showing future income. Proof that we're not just desperate, we're viable." "Will the bank accept that?" Martha Chen asked. "We're about to find out." The ride back took 2 days without the cattle to slow them down. 2 days of hard riding through snow that had started falling again, through passes that seemed determined to bury them. 2 days of not knowing if Grace and Thomas were still alive, if the ranch was still standing, if Harrison Thorne had made his move while they were gone. They stopped at Grace's ranch first, found her and Thomas alive, though Thomas was weak from blood loss and infection. Grace's eyes filled with tears when she saw them. "You did it," she said. "You actually did it." "We got the money," Margaret confirmed. "Not all of it, but enough to fight with." They left supplies, promised to send the doctor from town, and rode on. By the time Margaret saw her own ranch in the distance, small and weathered against the white landscape, she was so tired she could barely sit her horse. But then the cabin door burst open and 3 small figures came running out. Ruth and Rose and Jamie, bundled in coats, shouting and waving. Benjamin stood in the doorway trying to look dignified, but failing to hide his grin. Margaret slid off her horse before it fully stopped and caught her children in her arms. All of them at once, a tangle of limbs and tears and laughter. "You're back," Ruth kept saying. "You're back, you're back, you're back." "I promised, didn't I?" Margaret held them tighter. Garrett's always keep their promises. That night, after the children were fed and bathed and finally asleep, Margaret sat at the table with Dan and went through the numbers one more time. Cash in hand, $575. Contract value, $200. Advance plus guaranteed spring sales. Total liquid assets, $775. Amount owed to bank, $800. Base loan, plus 6 months interest at 12% plus late fees. Total debt approximately $950. Shortfall $175. We're still short, Dan said, stating the obvious. But we have the contract. That's proof of future income. That has to count for something. To a reasonable bank, maybe. To a bank manager who's in Thorne's pocket. Dan shook his head. I don't know, Maggie. Then we make him reasonable. Margaret's jaw was set. We walk in there with $775 and a contract, and we demand a new payment schedule. We show them we're serious. We show them we're not giving up. And if they refuse, then we take it to the territorial governor, to the federal marshal, to every newspaper between here and Washington. Her eyes were fierce. We make so much noise they can't ignore us. Dan looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. You know what, I think you might actually pull this off. We might pull this off, together. Together, he agreed. The next morning they rode into Bitter Creek. Margaret wore her best dress, the one she'd altered and re-altered to hide the worst of the wear. Dan wore his Sunday clothes such as they were. They walked into the bank like they owned it. The bank manager, a man named Sykes, looked up from his desk. His face went pale when he saw them. Mrs. Garrett, Mr. Garrett, I didn't expect. We're here to make a payment on our loan, Margaret said crisply. She placed the money on his desk with a solid thump. $775 in this. She laid down the contract from Harrison. Sykes stared at the money like it might bite him. Mr. Thorne said. I don't care what Mr. Thorne said, Margaret interrupted. This is $775 in cash and a contract guaranteeing future income. I want a receipt and I want a new payment schedule for the remaining balance. Mrs. Garrett, this is highly irregular. The loan was due in full. The original loan was $800. This is $775. We're only short by $25 on the principal, and we have a contract showing we can pay the rest within 3 months. But the interest, the late fees are negotiable, Margaret said firmly, especially when the alternative is us going to the territorial governor with evidence of fraud and extortion. Sykes went even paler. I don't know what you're talking about. Margaret leaned forward. The territorial governor has received a full accounting of Harrison Thorne's activities in this valley. So has the federal marshal's office. So has every major newspaper in Wyoming. 11 ranchers have signed testimonies documenting years of sabotage, price manipulation, and conspiracy. She pulled out copies of the letters from her bag. It's all here. Dates, witnesses, evidence. Now you can choose to work with us and accept this payment and a new schedule. Or you can refuse, and when the federal marshal arrives to investigate, I'll make sure he knows that the bank was complicit in Thorne's schemes. Sykes's hands were shaking as he picked up the contract, read it, set it down. I'll need to consult. You'll write the receipt now, Margaret said, and you'll draw up a new payment schedule, $175 due in 3 months once our spring cattle sales go through. That's reasonable, that's fair, and that's what's going to happen. For a long moment, Sykes just stared at her. Then slowly he reached for his pen. They walked out of the bank with a receipt and a new payment schedule and something that felt dangerously like hope. But Margaret knew better than to celebrate yet. Thorne wouldn't take this quietly. As if summoned by her thoughts, she saw him across the street. Harrison Thorne standing next to his horse, watching them. When their eyes met, his face darkened with fury. He started walking toward them. Maggie, Dan said quietly, get behind me. No. Maggie, I said no. Thorne stopped a few feet away. Up close, Margaret could see the rage barely contained beneath his polished exterior. You broke our agreement. You threatened my children, Margaret said calmly. That broke the agreement first. I warned you what would happen if you went to the authorities. You did. But here's the thing, Mr. Thorne. I'm done being afraid of you. Thorne's hand moved toward his gun. Dan stepped forward, his own hand ready. The street around them went quiet as people stopped to watch. Then a new voice cut through the tension. Everyone stay calm. A man in a long coat stepped out of the general store. He wore a badge on his chest, but it wasn't the local sheriff's star. This was a federal marshal's badge. Harrison Thorne, the marshal said. I'm Marshal William Grant. I have a warrant for your arrest. Thorne's face went from red to white. This is ridiculous. I have rights. I have lawyers. You do, Grant agreed, and you'll have your day in court. But right now you're coming with me. He gestured to two deputies who'd appeared from an alley. Charges include fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to murder in the death of Miguel Santos. This is a setup, Thorne snarled, looking at Margaret. She planned this. We have 11 signed testimonies, Grant interrupted. We have financial records showing systematic fraud. We have witnesses to fence-cutting, cattle poisoning, arson. He stepped closer. You made a lot of enemies, Mr. Thorne, and they all decided to speak at once. The deputies moved in, putting Thorne in irons. As they led him away, he looked back at Margaret one last time. This isn't over. Yes, Margaret said quietly, it is. The crowd that had gathered burst into applause. Not everyone. Some of Thorne's allies looked grim. But enough. Enough to show that the valley was changing, that the stranglehold of fear was breaking. Mrs. Crawford appeared at Margaret's elbow. Well, the older woman said, her severe face showing something that might have been approval. I'll be damned. Mrs. Crawford, Margaret said, surprised. You didn't think I'd stand against Thorne? The older woman snorted. Girl, I've been waiting 20 years for someone to have the spine to do what you just did. I just didn't think it would be a $3 bride. Best $3 ever spent, Dan murmured. The trial took 2 weeks to convene, bringing a territorial judge all the way from Cheyenne. The courthouse in Bitter Creek was packed every day with ranchers and townspeople, some supporting Thorne, most supporting the prosecution. Thorne's lawyers fought hard. They challenged evidence, questioned witnesses, tried to paint the whole thing as a conspiracy by failing ranchers jealous of a successful man. But the evidence was overwhelming. Grace Mitchell testified about Miguel's death, her voice steady even when describing finding her husband trampled in the field. Thomas Gray testified about the poisoned water that killed half his herd. Martha Chen brought the fire marshal's report on her barn, showing signs of accelerant that the original investigation had missed. One by one, the 11 ranchers told their stories, and Margaret presented the financial records showing the pattern of price manipulation, the double billing, the systematic fraud that had enriched Thorne while impoverishing everyone else. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty on conspiracy charges. Guilty on fraud. Insufficient evidence on the murder charge, but the judge allowed that civil suits could proceed. Sentenced 10 years in the territorial prison. Assets seized to pay restitution. Business holdings dissolved and sold at auction. When the verdict was read, Harrison Thorne's face was stone. But his empire, built over 20 years of ruthless acquisition, crumbled in a single afternoon. Outside the courthouse, the 11 ranching families celebrated quietly. Not with joy. There had been too much pain for that. But with relief. With the sense that something broken had finally been made right, or at least less wrong. It's really over, Diego said, standing beside Margaret in the winter sunlight. Not over, Margaret replied, but changed. We changed it. You changed it. You gave us hope when we'd forgotten what it felt like. I gave us a push. We did the rest together. Spring came to Wyoming the way it had always did, reluctant and grudging melting snow, revealing brown grass that would eventually turn green. The cattle that had survived the winter grew fat on new growth. Calves were born, doubling the herds. And in April, when the world finally remembered how to be warm, Margaret Garrett stood in a small church and married Joseph Garrett for the second time. The whole valley turned out, all 11 ranching families, Mrs. Crawford, who donated fabric for Margaret's dress, the bank manager Sykes, who'd been surprisingly helpful once Thorne was gone, even Marshal Grant, who'd stayed in the area to help with the civil suits. Margaret wore a dress that Grace and Martha had helped her make. Simple but beautiful white with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Her 5 children stood beside her at the altar. Catherine holding Rose Ruth, bouncing with barely contained excitement, Benjamin and Jamie in borrowed suits that made them look impossibly grown up. And Dan. Dan in his best clothes, face clean-shaven eyes, full of something that made Margaret's heart stop and restart. Father McKenna smiled at the congregation. We are gathered here today to witness something rare and precious. A second chance. A renewal of vows first spoken in desperation and now spoken in choice. The words washed over Margaret, but she was looking at Dan, at the man who'd spent his last $3 on a stranger because he saw something worth saving, at the partner who'd stood beside her through blizzards and battles and impossible odds, at the love she'd stopped believing in until she found it in the most unexpected place. Do you, Margaret Rose Brennan Garrett, take this man, Father McKenna began. I do, Margaret interrupted. Father McKenna blinked. I hadn't finished the question. I know, Margaret said, squeezing Dan's hands, but the answer's always going to be yes. No matter what comes, no matter how hard it gets. Yes. Dan smiled, the expression lighting his whole face. I do too, in case anyone was wondering. The congregation laughed. Father McKenna shook his head, but couldn't hide his own smile. Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. Again. He gestured to Dan. You may kiss your bride. Dan did thoroughly to the sound of cheers and applause. Afterward, the celebration spilled out of the church and into the street. There was food more than Margaret had seen in years. Music from a fiddle player who traveled from Cheyenne, dancing in the spring sunshine. Mrs. Crawford pressed Margaret's hand. Her usual frown softened into something almost warm. You did good, girl. Better than anyone expected. I had help. You had stubbornness. That's rarer than help. The older woman's eyes were bright. You reminded this town what fighting for something looks like. That's not nothing. Late in the afternoon, when the sun was starting to sink toward the mountains, Margaret found herself standing with Dan on the porch of their cabin. The same porch where they'd planned battles and made impossible decisions, where they'd fallen in love without meaning to. 3 months ago, I was ready to give up, Dan said quietly. Accept defeat. Let Thorn take everything. And now I've got you. I've got 5 children who call me Mr. Dan, and sometimes when they forget just Dan. I've got a future instead of just a past. He turned to face her. You saved me, Maggie, not just the ranch, mi poamo. You saved me too, Margaret said. You looked at a woman worth $3 and saw something valuable. That's everything. Dan pulled her close. Best $3 I ever spent. You keep saying that, because it keeps being true. They stood there as the sun set, painting the sky orange and gold. Behind them in the cabin, their children were laughing. Around them, the land they'd fought for stretched out in all directions. 60 acres that had cost everything and been worth every bit of it. $3 and a leap of faith. A partnership born of desperation and forged in fire. A family built from broken pieces. It wasn't the life Margaret had planned. It was better. 30 years later, on a spring afternoon in 1914, an old woman sat on that same porch with her great-grandson. Margaret was 62 now, her hair more gray than brown, her hands gnarled with arthritis. But her eyes were still sharp, still fierce. The boy, Robert, was 7 years old and full of questions. He'd been asking about the ranch, about how it had grown from 60 acres to 600, from 50 head of cattle to 500. How did you do it, Great-Grandma? He asked. How did you and Great-Grandpa build all this? Margaret looked out at the ranch. At the expanded house, the new barns, the cattle grazing on land that stretched to the horizon. Catherine ran the day-to-day operations, now married with children of her own. Benjamin managed the books, his early lessons in record-keeping having grown into genuine talent. Ruth and Jamie had ranches of their own nearby. Even Rose, the youngest, had married a rancher and stayed in the valley. It started with $3, Margaret said. $3, Robert's eyes went wide. That's all. That's all your great-grandfather had when he bid on me at an auction. 3 silver dollars, everything he owned in the world. She pulled a ring from her finger. It was silver tarnished with age, the band worn thin from decades of wearing. This ring cost $3. It bought more than a marriage. It bought a partnership, a family, a legacy. Robert held the ring carefully, understanding even at 7 that he was holding something precious. What happened to Great-Grandpa Dan? He asked. He died 3 years ago. Margaret said, her voice steady despite the grief that still lived in her chest. 30 years we had together. Built this ranch from $3 and nothing else. Was he a good man? He was the best man I ever knew. He saw value in a desperate widow with 5 children when no one else would. He fought beside me when the world said we couldn't win. He loved me when I'd forgotten how to love myself. She took the ring back, held it up to the light. You know what this taught me, Robert? Your value isn't what someone else decides. It's what you decide. I was auctioned it for $3 less than a lame mule, but I was worth so much more. We all are. What should I do with the ring? Keep it. Pass it to your children someday. Tell them the story of the $3 bride who refused to quit. Tell them about great-grandpa Dan who saw worth in worthlessness. Tell them that sometimes the craziest things save us. That sometimes you have to bet everything on a stranger. That some impossible odds are exactly what you need to find out who you really are. Robert nodded solemnly, tucking the ring into his pocket like a talisman. And most of all, Margaret said, tell them never to quit, even when losing seems certain, even when everyone tells you to give up, especially then. Because sometimes, just sometimes, $3 and a stubborn heart can build a dynasty. She looked out at the ranch one more time, at everything they'd built from nothing. At the legacy that would outlive her children, maybe outlive the century itself. The sun was setting again, painting the sky the same colors it had painted 30 years ago on her wedding day. Margaret closed her eyes and felt Dan beside her, as real as memory, as permanent as love. Thank you, she whispered to the wind, to the man who'd saved her by letting her save herself. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for $3 and everything that came after. The wind whispered back, carrying the scent of spring grass and cattle and home. And Margaret Garrett, born Margaret Brennan, once worth $3 on an auction block, smiled. She had lived. She had fought. She had won. Not because she was the strongest or the smartest or the luckiest, but because she wasn't too stubborn to quit. Because she found a partner who matched her stubbornness with his own. Because together they were stronger than either of them alone. The story of the $3 bride would be told for generations in the valley. It would grow with each telling, becoming legend, becoming myth, but at its heart would always be the truth. Sometimes the best investments can't be measured in money. Sometimes $3 can buy everything. And sometimes when you refuse to break, when you stand tall, even when the world wants you on your knees, you don't just survive, you thrive. Robert went inside as the stars began to appear. Margaret sat a while longer, watching the night claim the day, feeling the weight of years and the lightness of peace. Tomorrow, Catherine would ask her advice on the spring sales. Benjamin would show her the updated ledgers. The grandchildren would run through the house, making noise and mess and joy. But tonight, Margaret sat with memories, with a man who'd loved her, with children who'd grown strong, with a ranch built from impossible odds, with $3 silver that had bought the world. She stood slowly, arthritis making her movements careful, and walked inside to her family. The door closed behind her. The porch stood empty in the starlight. But if you listened carefully, you could almost hear it. The ghost of a conversation, the echo of a promise, the whisper of a man saying $3 and a woman saying yes. And that yes had changed everything.